identify those responsible. We welcome the decision by the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to open an investigation. In Russia, over 6,000 anti-war protesters have been detained and multiple independent media outlets blocked over their factual reporting on the war. This too should be the subject of Council scrutiny. For 8 years, civilians have borne the brunt of the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine, from indiscriminate attacks to travel restrictions, limited access to food, healthcare, education, and basic services. The Council should send a strong message that there will be no impunity for the crimes committed in Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra a joint statement, Engineer Dumont.
Welcome this urgent meeting on Russia's aggression against the people of Ukraine. On the 24th of February, the Ukrainian ambassador requested this council to meet, quote, as urgently as possible. Now, in other past situations, the council convened within a day. Why this time on Russian aggression did it wait a full week? For the men, women, and children under attack, every day of delay by the international community is lethal. This council just heard from the Russian foreign minister. He said President Putin has, quote, an unwavering respect for the Ukrainian people, and that, quote, we do not intend in any way to infringe on the interests of the citizens of Ukraine. Mr. President, the opposite is true. The truth is that Russian forces invaded Ukraine in flagrant violation of the United Nations Charter and international law. The truth is that Russian forces are bombing cities indiscriminately, killing and wounding innocent civilians, a gross violation of the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law. The truth is that Russia's assault on Ukraine has turned 500,000 people into refugees, forcing them to flee their home for neighboring countries, killed an estimated 2,000 people, and injured many more. The truth is that Russia is committing war crimes. And so the question before us today is this: will the international community defend the rules-based international order? Dictators around the world are watching. If they see that Russia succeeds in its wanton aggression, they will draw the lesson that anything goes. We will see more invasions, more tyrannies, attacking their neighbors, and more terrorism. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra International Bar Association.
The International Bar Association's Human Rights Institute resolutely condemns the ongoing and unjustified military invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation as a flagrant violation of international law, including the UN Charter. We are dismayed at the emerging reports of violations of international human rights and humanitarian law, including violations of the right to life, liberty and security occurring in Ukraine. We also firmly condemn the arbitrary detention of peaceful protesters in the Russian Federation and in Belarus, and violations of the right to assembly, association and expression and media freedom. We are alarmed by ongoing violations in areas controlled by Russia and in the temporarily Russia-occupied Crimea, involving extrajudicial killings, abductions and enforced disappearances. The Bari urges the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally cease its military invasion into the Ukrainian territory. We urge all parties to ensure immediate, safe and unhindered humanitarian access. The Bari welcomes the decision of the ICC prosecutors to proceed with opening an investigation into the situation in Ukraine. We call on this Council to take all possible actions to ensure accountability for perpetrators, to end impunity and to prevent further deterioration of the situation. The Bari strongly supports the establishment of a commission of inquiry to initiate prompt, independent and impartial investigation into all violations. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Associazione Comunità Papa Giovanni 23.
APG 23 calls for an immediate halt to hostilities in Ukraine. Once again, the folly of war is being chosen, the most devastating impact of which falls on civilians and defenseless populations. We would like to echo what Pope Francis said: those who wage war forget humanity. They do not start from the people, but put partisan interest and power in front of everything. With our long practice as a non-violent peace corps in war zone, we witnessed the catastrophic consequences of wars, widows, orphans and destroyed lives. On the other side, we experienced the constructive force of non-violence. The war in Ukraine, like any other conflict, violates the human rights of individuals and peoples to peace, as well as all the other human rights. We express our solidarity with the populations involved in this conflict and support the efforts of civil society in Ukraine and the Russian Federation, working towards an immediate cessation of hostilities for embarking on a path of true peace and reconciliation. A process of disarmament is urgently needed to guarantee peace. Even more urgent is the need to prevent an escalation into a nuclear war and ensure the humanitarian protection of civilians by also activating humanitarian corridors. In this regard, APG23, as other NGOs, has already started its humanitarian mobilization. We appeal to the UN and all concerned parties to strive for an end to the fighting, by all means of diplomacy, implementing the principle of peaceful settlement of disputes. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra United Nations Watch.
Council prepared to defend international peace and basic human rights, to oppose aggression on a scale unseen in Europe since World War II? Will they uphold their responsibility to defend the rules-based international order? Let us consider. 2 years ago, despite our urgent appeals not to do it, the UN elected Russia as a member of this Human Rights Council. This violated the Council's own rules. Members are obliged to uphold the highest standards of human rights. Mr. President, does this Council believe that Russia's bombing of civilians in Kyiv, Kharkiv, and other cities and towns across Ukraine upholds the highest standards of human rights? Under the Council's rules, members can be removed on account of gross and systematic violations of human rights. Therefore, if this Council is serious, here's what it must do. 1. Remove Russia from the Council immediately. 2. Adopt a resolution on the situation of human rights within Russia itself. 3. Establish an independent monitor to protect courageous Russian dissidents, such as Alexei Navalny and Vladimir Karamurza, both of whom were poisoned. 4. Abolish the mandate known as the Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Coercive Measures, the purpose of which is to define sanctions against Russia and other dictatorships as illegal. 5. Demand the High Commissioner and independent experts speak out against the crimes in Ukraine. Mr. President, the people of Ukraine are under assault. The time to act is now. Thank you.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Amnistía Internacional.
Recording this from a safe place, but part of my team, my family, my friends are now in bomb shelters. As I speak, Russian forces are encircling cities. They are bombing schools with cluster munitions. They are wreaking havoc on civilians and civilian infrastructure. I have witnessed firsthand the unimaginable horror that I would wish on no one, and I fear the worst is yet to come. Russia's invasion to my country is deplorable. It is a violation of the United Nations Charter. It is an act of aggression and an international crime. It cannot stand. As a civilian in Ukraine, as a member of Amnesty International, I look to the UN Security Council for protection, for myself, for my family, for my country, for all those fleeing, for the civil society community in Ukraine operating at great risk. Yet, the Security Council is blocked by the same government that now invades and attacks. This is perverse. It is twisted. It is wrong. I now look to the Human Rights Council and to the ICC with the hope that their responses will be meaningful. This council must create a mechanism to protect the most vulnerable, promote accountability, and preserve evidence of crimes. I also look to Russia, where I see people taken to the streets to oppose this invasion. The same authorities that seek to crush my country are also seeking to crush their voices. The Human Rights Council must act with courage and ambition to stand against of all these violations and crimes.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Caritas Internationalis.
Caritas is gravely concerned by the current alarming humanitarian and human rights situation in Ukraine, with many civilian casualties. Caritas is witnessing alarmingly high numbers of internally displaced people and people fleeing into neighboring countries, and we appreciate their generosity and solidarity. The present situation in Ukraine is endangering international stability and peace, and echoing the Holy Father brings international law into disrepute. We call for international humanitarian law and human rights to be respected. The civilian population and aid workers must not be targeted, and safe evacuation of vulnerable groups must be facilitated. We appeal to the neighboring countries to continue welcoming refugees and provide assistance without discrimination, including third country nationals. The Caritas Confederation is also deeply concerned by the safety of migrants and refugees left in Ukraine and who are in urgent need of protection. We call on the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and relevant special procedures to closely monitor the human rights situation of vulnerable groups, both in the country and on the move, and who are exposed to increased risks and human rights violations, including human trafficking. Kyiv stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and all the victims of this crisis and appeals for peace.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra Human Rights House Foundation.
Mr. President, Human Rights House Foundation strongly condemns Russia's invasion of Ukraine and is appalled by the violence inflicted upon the Ukrainian people as a result of Russia's war. We are inspired by the courage of the Ukrainian people and stand in solidarity with them as they demand international support. HRHF calls on the Human Rights Council to mandate a commission of inquiry in order to promote accountability for human rights violations associated with Russia's war against Ukraine. We also call on member states to ensure full resources are available to the UN monitoring mission in Ukraine. At the same time, we implore the Council to establish a special rapporteur on human rights in Russia. For far too long, the international community has avoided taking concrete action to hold Russian authorities accountable for their domestic campaign to target civil society, silence dissenting and opposition voices, shutter free and independent media, and ban any form of peaceful protest. We now see that these actions to repress the freedoms of assembly, association, and expression have allowed the authorities to wage an unprovoked war against their neighbor. For these reasons, we also call on the Council to request the General Assembly to suspend Russia's membership in this body. We also remind member states to take all necessary steps to ensure the safety of Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian human rights defenders and their families as Russian authorities expand their brutal assault against them. In the short term, governments must be prepared to use their diplomatic presence in Ukraine to protect human rights defenders and their families at significant risk and facing imminent threat by Russian authorities. HRDs and their families will also continue to require urgent and emergency visa support and resources while abroad to continue their important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to a joint statement by Child Rights Connect.
Joint statement by Child Rights Connect, Eurochild and other NGOs. We stand in solidarity with all the children, families and organisations that are working in Ukraine and neighbouring countries in these extremely difficult times. We're profoundly concerned by the rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation facing children and the short and long-term consequences on their rights. We condemn the recent attacks on schools and kindergartens in Ukraine. The war will have knock-on effects throughout Europe at a time when the pandemic has already deepened inequalities. Russian Federation and Ukraine have both ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and its optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. We call on all parties to the conflict to abide by international humanitarian law and human rights law, ensure safe access to humanitarian assistance, protect civilians and vital infrastructure such as hospitals and schools. We echo the UN experts' call to protect the rights of all human rights defenders, including child human rights defenders, who are exercising their right to freedom of peaceful assembly, association and expression. As networks, organisations and individuals committed to protecting and promoting the human rights of children, we stand united against war. We reiterate the Secretary-General's call for a ceasefire and a return to dialogue to stop the escalation. We support the establishment of a commission of inquiry by the Council and any other accountability mechanisms to deal with violations and abuses of children's rights. Thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra International Service for Human Rights.
We condemn Russia's illegal war of aggression in Ukraine and associated massive human rights violations. We stand in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and with brave human rights defenders in Russia calling for an end to war and looking to the Council to contribute to peace, security and justice. We strongly support a commission of inquiry to promote accountability for human rights and humanitarian law violations and abuses associated with Russia's aggression. It is absurd and offensive to speak of constructive dialogue while Russian bombs and missiles indiscriminately kill Ukrainian children, women and men and destroy their hospitals and schools. We urge the Council to mandate a special rapporteur on human rights in Russia. Putin's ability to wage a war of aggression is aided and abetted by Russia's brutal repression of civil society, lack of free press, severe restrictions on freedom of expression, association and assembly, and massive disinformation. The Council should also recommend that the General Assembly suspend Russia's Council membership, which is a stain on the Council's institutional integrity. Finally, we welcome the unprecedented coordination, support, sanctions and humanitarian assistance provided by EU and other states in response to this crisis. We hope that this becomes the principal benchmark rather than the selective exception as to how the global community responds to all such grave human rights situations and brutal authoritarians.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra International Lawyers Organization.
InternationalLawyers.org recognizes that the human right to peace is the collateral of the prohibition of the use of force and the duty of all states to resolve their disputes peacefully in the United Nations Charter. We urge both Ukraine and Russia to resolve their dispute peacefully. We urge Russia to immediately bring itself into conformity with international law by ending its use of force against Ukraine. We recognize the right of a people's fighting for self-determination to use all necessary means to achieve this right. These means should, however, be strictly directed towards achieving self-determination. We are concerned that the unlawful use of force by member states of this Council has created the impression that the use of force in international law is acceptable. We urge the Council to reiterate that all uses of force that are not a response to an armed attack are inconsistent with the right to peace. This includes the unlawful use of force against the people of Afghanistan, Iraq, Palestine, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Sudan, Algeria, Haiti, Panama, Grenada, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, among others. If law is weaponized to punish only some unlawful uses of force, the rule of international law is weakened. All unlawful uses of force should have the consequence that they are ended and that reparations are made to those who have suffered as required by international law. The right to peace is a right of all persons.
Gracias. Tiene la palabra International Human Rights Association of American Minorities.
National Human Rights Association of American Minorities deplores the loss of life in Ukraine, calls for an immediate ceasefire and prompt humanitarian assistance. We condemn the violation of the prohibition of the use of force and deplore that over the past 30 years, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter has been violated by states who have conducted military activities without approval of the Security Council against Yugoslavia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, and Syria, where war crimes were committed with impunity. We deplore the continued bombardment of civilians in Yemen and condemn the silence of the international community when Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh were victims of aggression resulting in thousands of civilian deaths. Such illegal use of force created precedents of permissibility and diminished the authority of the United Nations. While Iran calls upon Russia to stop its aggression in Ukraine, third parties must refrain from adding fuel to the fire. Ukraine and NATO should respect the legitimate security interests of Russia, who feels threatened by its hostile eastward expansion and by the flooding of Ukraine with lethal weapons. We recall that Article 2.4 of the Charter prohibits not only the use of force, but also the threat thereof. In 1962, the world was saved from nuclear apocalypse by a quid pro quo. Soviets removed missiles from Cuba, Americans removed missiles from Turkey. Today, the world demands a compromise that guarantees sustainable peace based on a new security architecture for Europe and the world.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Minority Rights Group.
This statement by a Ukrainian and international coalition of Romani human rights defenders and allies to call for peace and solidarity and call on the Russian Federation to cease the violence caused by the war against Ukraine. This war is not only a threat to European security and peace, it comes with violence of international humanitarian and human rights laws under the treaties ratified by Russia. As members of global community who has and continues to face far too many tragedies, we wish to express our deep concern regarding the fast escalation of violence and the increasing number of victims this war has already caused. From the Second World War to the Balkan Wars of the late 90s, history has shown us that in times of war or conflict, the plight of Roma, as well as other minorities, is continuously ignored, rendered invisible, and used to further our persecution. As we are witnessing people of all nations stand in solidarity in countries around the world, let us collectively fight for peace, justice, and integrity concretely by continuing to unite and take stand against the forces of war and violence, calling on authorities and aid actors to ensure that Roma minorities and marginalized people are granted equal access to protection and safety when persons seeking refuge, including those without identity documents. As Human Rights Council, we ask you to establish a commission of inquiry able to monitor the human rights violations and violence experienced by Roma and other minorities who often face double consequences during the war. I thank you so much.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra International Humanist and Ethical Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. The unprovoked and illegal invasion by Russia in Ukraine is a violation of the UN Charter and international law, including human rights law. As each day goes by, we witness an increasing number of gross and systematic violations of human rights. It is a tragedy unfolding before our eyes. This Council has a duty to respond. It must adopt a robust resolution, unequivocally condemning Russia's actions and establishing a commission of inquiry to report on the situation in Ukraine and promote accountability for all forms of human rights violations occurring there. Such violations are clearly facilitated and sustained by the oppressive human rights climate in the Russian Federation itself. The severe restrictions on free expression, the widespread propagation of disinformation, the repression of civil society, and the intimidation, censoring, and criminalization of journalists all contribute to the Russian government being able to wage a war of aggression without accountability at home. Accordingly, any Council resolution needs to create a mandate for a special rapporteur on the human rights situation in Russia. Mr. President, we meet today at the UN Human Rights Council, a body specifically tasked with protecting and promoting the human rights of all. To have a country that is, as we speak, dropping bombs on innocent civilians and willfully blocking any action at the UN Security Council, continue to sit as a member of this Council is nothing less than a stain on the Council's integrity and a shame on us all. Any resolution adopted must urge the General Assembly to suspend Russia's Human Rights Council membership immediately. I thank you.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Civicus stands in solidarity with the people of Ukraine and calls for a swift, unified and targeted international response. The protection of human rights defenders, journalists and activists must be a priority. Human rights defenders and journalists have a responsibility to document human rights violations, a role which is critical for the international community to hold perpetrators responsible. In a letter to the United Nations Commissioner for Human Rights a few days before the invasion, the United States expressed serious concerns about information in its possession that Russia has created lists of journalists, activists and minority groups whom they plan to kill or send to camps. All parties to the conflict have a responsibility to protect human rights defenders, journalists and civilian populations and to guarantee the free flow of humanitarian aid. An act of aggression on this scale needs commensurate response. We call upon the Council to create an investigative and accountability mechanism to monitor, investigate, and document human rights violations so that perpetrators can be identified and held to account. Russia is rated as repressed on the Civicus Monitor, and journalists and activists have long been the target of government crackdowns. It is clear that a nation that does not respect the rights of its own people will not respect the rights of others. In this context, Russia has no place as a member of the premier human rights body of the UN, and we join calls for Russia to be suspended from Council membership.
Thank you. Tiene la palabra Institute for NGO Research.
Thank you. The world is horrified and appalled by the Russian aggression against an invasion of Ukraine. Russia is engaged in mass war crimes and crimes against humanity, including indiscriminate bombings on apartment buildings, opera houses, and parks. Russia has attacked Jewish cultural heritage sites like the Barbie Yar Memorial. And Russia has employed prohibited thermobaric bombs wreaking mass destruction. Unlike in other conflicts, Ukrainians are not firing hundreds of rockets a day on Moscow or St. Petersburg. They are not suicide bombing Russian buses, weddings, or kindergartens. They are not setting up their military headquarters in hospitals, nor storing mass arsenals of missiles in churches, schools, or UN facilities. They are not shooting at, balloon bombing, nor digging dozens of terror tunnels to kill and kidnap Russians living along the border. They are simply defending against a blatant attack on their existence. Since 2014, this Council has done next to nothing on Russia's aggression in the region. It has adopted no company blacklist for Russian settlement business. There have been no moves to cooperate with ongoing ICC investigations. There have been no commissions of inquiry, permanent or otherwise. And just last week, a day before the invasion,